You are about to hear a story that most history books barely mention. In the final weeks of the Second World War, hundreds of fully armed German soldiers surrendered without firing a single shot. They had ammunition. They had defensive positions. They had orders to resist. Yet when American troops appeared, their commander calmly walked forward with a white flag. No battle, no explosion, no final stand, just silence. And behind that silence was something far more powerful than bullets. Before we go deeper, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel, because here on WWII History Insights, we uncover the hidden moments that changed history forever. What happened in those final weeks of March 1945 was not just a military advance. It was the collapse of belief itself. On March 27, 1945, at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, an American reconnaissance unit moved cautiously along a secondary road in western Germany. They expected resistance. Intelligence reports suggested enemy forces were still active in the area. Instead, they saw something strange. A small group of German soldiers emerged from behind a tree line. One officer stepped forward. In his hand was a white cloth tied to a stick. Behind him stood nearly 300 soldiers, fully equipped, rifles slung over their shoulders, machine guns positioned but unmanned. They were not wounded. They were not surrounded in that moment. They were simply finished. The American lieutenant in charge did not understand what he was seeing. His men prepared for a trap. But no trap came. The German officer approached and spoke calmly through an interpreter. He stated that his regiment would surrender immediately. No conditions, no negotiations, no demands for medical treatment or safe passage. Just surrender. When asked why, he gave an answer that would echo across multiple sectors of the collapsing German front. He said, "Your forces are everywhere. We no longer know where the front is. There is no point in dying." That sentence revealed something bigger than a tactical defeat. It revealed total disorientation. In war, soldiers fight because they understand their position. They know where the enemy is. They know where their own lines are. They believe reinforcements exist. But by late March 1945, that clarity was disappearing at terrifying speed. The American Third Army under General George S. Patton was not advancing in a straight, predictable line. It was moving fast, cutting roads, seizing bridges, bypassing strong points, appearing in places German commanders thought were secure. Units that believed they were behind the front suddenly found American armor moving past them. Communication lines were breaking down. Telephone wires were cut by artillery or simply abandoned. Radio signals were jammed or drowned out by chaos. Orders from higher headquarters were delayed or contradictory. Some commanders ordered counterattacks. Others ordered withdrawal. But withdraw to where? Fight where? Against which direction? The map that German officers carried in their pockets no longer matched reality on the ground. Within 48 hours of that first surrender, similar scenes unfolded across multiple villages. Entire battalions laid down their weapons after brief negotiations. Some had not even fired their artillery. Ammunition dumps remained untouched. Defensive trenches were intact. Yet the will to hold them had dissolved. American units began to notice a pattern. Whenever they pushed aggressively forward, bypassing resistance and striking deeper than expected, isolated German formations assumed they were already encircled. This was not just military pressure. It was psychological compression. Imagine being a company commander and receiving reports that American tanks were seen 20 miles behind you, then hearing that another American column crossed a river thought to be secure, then losing radio contact with division headquarters. Every hour the map becomes less reliable. Every rumor becomes believable. Fear multiplies faster than facts. The German officer who surrendered that afternoon was not a coward. According to later interrogation records, he had fought on the Eastern Front and survived brutal campaigns. But by March 1945, he understood something many others were beginning to accept. The war was no longer about holding territory. It was about survival. And survival sometimes meant choosing not to fight. But this was only the beginning. Because what looked like isolated surrenders would soon reveal a larger operational reality. one shaped by speed, confusion, and the deliberate aggression of Patton's Third Army. And as more units collapsed without major combat, American commanders began to realize they were witnessing something rare in modern warfare, a front dissolving from within. By the time the sun rose on March 28, 1945, the surrender of that 1st Regiment no longer looked like an isolated incident. Reports were arriving from multiple directions. Small American units, sometimes no larger than reinforced platoons, were encountering entire German formations willing to negotiate within minutes of contact. At first, American officers suspected deception. German forces had used delay tactics before, but this felt different. There were no hidden machine gun nests waiting to open fire. No salen artillery varillas. Instead, there were exhausted faces, officers studying maps that no longer made sense, and the same repeated phrase, "We are cut off." What made this collapse so unusual was that many of these German units were not physically surrounded. On paper, escape routes still existed. Roads remained open. Bridges had not all been destroyed. Yet psychologically, the encirclement felt complete. Patton's Third Army had moved with such speed that it created the illusion of total penetration. Armored divisions were crossing rivers faster than German intelligence could track. Engineers were throwing temporary bridges across waterways that were assumed to be natural defensive lines. Columns advanced day and night, headlights sometimes covered, engines roaring across farmland and small towns before defenders even realized they were near. In one small crossroads village on March 29, 1945, an American tank column rolled into the center square expecting resistance. Instead, they found a German battalion assembling in formation, weapons stacked neatly on the ground. Their major stepped forward and saluted before surrendering. When questioned, he explained that he had received conflicting orders for 2 days. Higher command had instructed him to counterattack westward, but reconnaissance reported American forces already positioned east of his location. Another message ordered withdrawal south, yet reports suggested American armor was advancing from that direction as well. With communication lines severed and no clear front line, he concluded that movement in any direction risked immediate destruction. So he chose surrender over pointless loss. This pattern reveals something critical about late war Germany. Soldiers were still disciplined. Units were still organized. But belief in coordinated defense was collapsing. War depends not only on weapons, but on confidence that someone above you understands the larger picture. Once that trust erodes, every soldier feels alone. Meanwhile, Patton's strategy amplified the chaos. Rather than pausing to consolidate gains, Third Army commanders kept pushing forward. When resistance appeared strong, they sometimes bypassed it, leaving pockets of German troops stranded without supply routes. Those isolated groups often woke the next morning to find American vehicles moving behind them. The sound of engines in unexpected directions became more terrifying than artillery. It suggested invisibility. It suggested omnipresence. Rumors spread faster than verified information. Some German soldiers believed entire American armored divisions had teleported across rivers overnight. Others thought airborne units had landed behind their lines. In reality, it was a combination of aggressive reconnaissance, rapid engineering work, and relentless momentum. But perception in war can be more powerful than reality. If you believe you are surrounded, you often behave as though you are. American interrogation teams noticed another shift. Earlier in the war, captured German officers often spoke with ideological conviction. Even in defeat, they defended strategic choices. Now, in late March 1945, many simply expressed fatigue. They asked practical questions about prisoner treatment, food, and the future of their families. The grand speeches about final victory had vanished. Still, not every sector collapsed instantly. Some German units fought stubbornly, especially where defensive terrain favored them. But even there, the knowledge that neighboring formations had surrendered weakened resolve. The front was no longer a solid wall. It was a cracked surface under pressure. And beneath that pressure stood the driving force of Third Army's tempo. Patton understood that speed could replace firepower. Every mile gained without pause multiplied uncertainty behind enemy lines. Every bridge captured intact shattered assumptions. The Germans were not simply losing ground. They were losing orientation. What would happen when entire Corps headquarters began to experience the same confusion that regiments had already felt? Because the next phase of this collapse would not occur at a crossroads village. It would happen at a command center where maps covered the walls and telephones rang without answers. On the morning of March 30th, 1945, inside a former school building serving as a German Corps headquarters, confusion replaced confidence. Large wall maps showed neat defensive lines drawn in pencil only 2 days earlier. Those lines were now meaningless. Reports from subordinate divisions arrived late, incomplete, and often contradictory. One division claimed American armor was pressing from the west. Another insisted enemy columns had been sighted far to the north. A third had gone completely silent. The operations officer stood before the map table, trying to create order from fragments. Telephone lines failed without warning. Radio transmissions were filled with static. Couriers dispatched at dawn had not returned. Each new report forced erasures and revisions, until the map looked less like a battle plan and more like a storm of scattered arrows. The Corps commander, a seasoned general who had served since the early campaigns of the war, studied the chaos quietly. Finally, he asked a question that no one in the room could answer. Where exactly is our front? No officer responded. There was no single line. American forces were not advancing in a slow, predictable wave. They were slicing through weak points, bypassing strongholds, and appearing unexpectedly deep in rear areas. At approximately 6 in the morning, an urgent message arrived that silenced the room. American armored vehicles had been sighted east of headquarters, nearly 12 kilometers away. East, not west. East meant behind them. It meant that what they believed to be safe rear territory was no longer secure. The general ordered immediate displacement. Staff officers rushed to gather documents, codebooks, and communication equipment. Trucks were loaded in haste. The plan was simple: move further east and re-establish command from a safer position. Yet were no longer followed simple logic. As the convoy prepared to depart, reconnaissance scouts returned with alarming news. The primary eastern road was blocked. American vehicles had been spotted moving along it. An alternate route to the northeast was proposed. The convoy began moving in that direction, only to encounter military police reporting American presence there as well. For a brief moment, the entire headquarters column halted on a rural road, engines idling. Senior officers gathered around a map spread across the hood of a staff car. Every possible escape route seemed compromised or uncertain. The Americans were not just approaching from one direction. They were weaving through the countryside unpredictably. Then an American reconnaissance aircraft passed overhead at low altitude. Its presence was brief, but the message was clear. The enemy was watching. The Corps commander made a decision that would have been unthinkable earlier in the war. The headquarters would split into smaller groups. Essential staff and radios would move cross-country, avoiding main roads. Non-essential equipment would be abandoned. This was no longer a functioning command center coordinating divisions. It was a group of officers trying to survive long enough to regain communication. By midday, the general, accompanied by a handful of officers, moved cautiously through wooded terrain. They had lost contact with most subordinate units. Radios lacked sufficient range. In theory, he commanded tens of thousands of soldiers. In practice, he commanded fewer than 15 men walking through farmland. The psychological shift was immense. Authority depends on information. Without communication, rank becomes symbolic. The general could issue no orders because he had no understanding of who remained in position, who had surrendered, and who was already surrounded. As evening approached, the group encountered a scattered supply convoy. The drivers reported that American forces seemed to be everywhere. Some roads were blocked by armored vehicles. Other routes were open, but rumored to be unsafe. Rumor had become more influential than confirmed intelligence. By nightfall, The Corps commander managed to re-establish limited contact with higher headquarters. His report was blunt. Divisions were fragmented. Command cohesion had collapsed. The distinction between front line and rear area no longer existed. This breakdown at Corps level mirrored what had already happened to regiments and battalions. When command structures dissolve, individual units are left to interpret chaos alone. Some chose to fight. Many chose to surrender. But increasingly, decisions were made not based on battlefield defeat, but on isolation. The war in this sector was not being lost through massive firefights. It was being lost through fragmentation. And as Corps headquarters struggled to survive, something even more dramatic was unfolding among field commanders who suddenly realized they were holding positions that no longer mattered. By the afternoon of March 30th, 1945, the pattern had become unmistakable. German units that were fully armed, properly supplied, and positioned in defensible terrain were surrendering without being decisively defeated in battle. At a crossroads several kilometers south of the main American thrust, a German lieutenant colonel commanded 2 infantry companies, an artillery battery, and a platoon of assault guns. His men were experienced. Their anti-tank weapons were positioned carefully. Fields of fire had been measured. The crossroads was tactically sound ground. Shortly after midday, forward observers reported American reconnaissance vehicles probing from the south. The lieutenant colonel watched through binoculars as armored cars approached cautiously, paused at long range, then withdrew. He felt a moment of confidence. The Americans were testing, not attacking. His defensive layout had discouraged a frontal assault. An hour later, engine noise was heard to the east. A patrol was sent and returned quickly with disturbing news. American vehicles had been seen on a secondary road behind the position. Soon another report arrived from the north. More American movement. Within a span of 90 minutes, the lieutenant colonel understood that his strong defensive position had already been bypassed. The crossroads he had been ordered to hold was no longer a barrier. It was an island. He attempted to contact regimental headquarters for guidance. No response. He tried division frequencies. Silence. His radio operator suggested that headquarters might have displaced or been overrun. The lieutenant colonel faced a reality that no training manual had truly prepared him for. He had orders to hold ground, but no command structure to confirm whether that ground still mattered. By early evening, light American artillery fire began landing near his outer positions. It was not a heavy bombardment. It felt measured, almost deliberate. Shells impacted at intervals, enough to remind his men that American gunners knew exactly where they were. It was pressure, not destruction. He assembled his company commanders and laid out the situation calmly. American units had been detected to the south, east, and north. The only direction without confirmed enemy presence was west, back toward what they hoped was German-held territory. But they did not know for certain. One company commander argued for immediate withdrawal while the route remained open. Another suggested staying in position until clear evidence of encirclement appeared. The lieutenant colonel understood both arguments. Withdrawal without orders felt like disobedience. Remaining risked total isolation. As darkness approached, he walked alone through his defensive line. Soldiers were alert but uneasy. They had ammunition. They had functioning weapons. They were ready to fight. But fight whom? And for what objective? He knew that even if they repelled an initial American probe, additional armored columns could arrive from any direction. Without communication or coordinated support, their tactical success would be temporary. The larger operational picture had already moved past them. By late evening, he made a decision that weighed heavily on him. If the situation remained unchanged by morning, he would seek terms of surrender. Not because his unit lacked courage, not because they were defeated, but because continuing to resist would achieve nothing except casualties in a war whose outcome was no longer in doubt in this sector. Similar scenes unfolded across the region. A German captain defending a small town was approached under a white flag by an American officer who calmly informed him that the town was surrounded. The captain confirmed through his own scouts that American vehicles had been seen on multiple approaches. His company had not been beaten in combat. Yet it had no connection to battalion headquarters and no knowledge of friendly forces nearby. He gathered his officers. A young lieutenant insisted they should fight regardless. An older sergeant asked a simple question: if we fight and fall, what changes? No one had an answer. 2 hours later, the captain stepped forward under a white flag. By the morning of March 31st, thousands of German soldiers across the sector had surrendered under similar circumstances. They were not demoralized by catastrophic battlefield losses. They were disoriented by speed. The Americans were advancing so rapidly, appearing from so many directions, that defensive positions became irrelevant before they could be used. This was not collapse through annihilation. It was collapse through isolation. And what happened next would reveal just how deeply this psychological shift had spread. By the first days of April 1945, what had begun as isolated incidents of surrender had grown into a pattern too large to ignore. Third Army headquarters began receiving reports that sounded almost unreal. Entire battalions were walking into American lines under white flags. Regimental staffs were surrendering with maps, radios, and vehicles still intact. Supply columns, wandering for days behind rapidly shifting lines, were simply giving up when they realized they had no idea where German territory even began. One American armored battalion commander reported capturing more than 400 German soldiers without firing a single round. Their commander approached calmly, removed his sidearm, and stated that his unit had been isolated for 2 days, had no contact with regiment or division, and had no mission that justified further resistance. His men were healthy. Their weapons were functional, but they were surrounded by a battlefield that no longer made sense. American interrogators began noticing a common theme in prisoner statements. The Germans did not describe dramatic defeat in combat. They described confusion. They described speed. They described feeling as if the war had moved around them and past them before they understood what was happening. A German major summarized it with painful clarity. "We could have fought. We would have died. Tomorrow you would have advanced anyway. So we chose not to die for nothing." This was not cowardice. It was calculation. Earlier in the war, German units had often fought to the last bullet, even in hopeless situations, believing their sacrifice delayed the enemy or strengthened the broader war effort. But by late March and early April 1945, that belief had eroded. Officers still possessed discipline and training. What they lacked was a coherent operational picture that gave meaning to resistance. When a battalion is surrounded with no communication, no clear objective, and no possibility of relief, the question changes from "can we fight?" to "why should we?" Third Army intelligence later analyzed the numbers from this rapid advance. In just a few days, more than 15,000 German soldiers had been captured in this sector. The number of German combat dead and wounded was a fraction of that total. The majority of enemy forces were removed from the war not by destruction, but by maneuver. This represented a different kind of victory. In earlier campaigns, success required grinding battles, heavy artillery, air bombardment, and enormous casualties on both sides. But here, speed itself became a weapon. American armored columns moved so rapidly that they penetrated deep into German rear areas before defensive plans could adjust. They cut communications. They seized crossroads. They bypassed strong points and left them tactically irrelevant. German officers found themselves defending positions that no longer mattered, holding ground that had already been outflanked, waiting for orders that would never arrive. The psychological impact was devastating. When a soldier cannot identify the front line, cannot contact command, and cannot understand the purpose of his position, resistance transforms from duty into isolation. And isolation drains the will to continue. General Patton's achievement during these days was not simply territorial gain. It was the collapse of cohesion. By moving faster than German command structures could respond, his forces shattered the framework that allowed organized resistance to function. Units did not need to be destroyed if they could be rendered irrelevant. Across towns and crossroads, white flags appeared not because soldiers lacked courage, but because their leaders recognized reality. The war in that region did not end in one massive decisive battle. It dissolved, quietly, rapidly, through a chain reaction of officers who looked at maps that no longer made sense, listened to radios that carried no answers, and chose survival over futile sacrifice. And that is the part of the story many people never hear. If you found this story powerful and eye-opening, make sure you like this video and subscribe for more deep World War II insights that most channels never explain. Before you go, tell me in the comments, do you think those German officers made the right decision, or should they have fought anyway? Share this video with someone who loves military history, because this moment shows that sometimes wars are not won by destroying armies, but by making them realize the battle is already over.